All right, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the workshop titled Lone Wolves and Loose Networks. I'm Assaf Moghadam from the ICT. I'll be chairing this session, and we have, as usual, really an outstanding panel here where we welcome back several of our speakers to this conference. Before we start, what we'll do is, first of all, this workshop is held in the memory of Erroll Sprinzak, who was the founding dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy. And he was a world-renowned expert on terrorism. He was perhaps one of Israel's really original terrorism experts. A world-renowned expert also on extremist politics and the radical right in Israel. He conceptualized theories of terrorist radicalization many years, decades really, before they became prominent after the London bombings. He also examined areas in terrorism that other researchers oftentimes avoided, such as the link between ideology and violence. He was also really a leading scholar. This is perhaps what he's most famous for. He was a leading scholar on Israel's radical right, who was really so professional as a researcher that even the terrorists themselves liked him. He interviewed many of them, and many of them really they voiced his respect for him as a scholar. Professor Sprinzak's unique insights on the topic of the radical right would have come in especially handy at the current atmosphere in which right-wing extremism in Israel, right-wing extremists have escalated their use of violence. In July, just 2 months ago, in July, we saw two recent examples. One was an arson attack on July 31st in the village of Duma, which resulted in the death of an 18-month-old baby, Ali Dawabshe, and his father. After a few days, two other members of his family were severely wounded. Just the day before, there was an attack on the Jerusalem Gay Pride Parade, in which a 16-year-old, also a stabbing. This was a stabbing attack in which 16-year-old Shira Banki was killed. So, in this environment, I think Professor Sprinzak's input would have been extremely valuable, as always. He would have also had a lot to say, of course, about the rise of the Islamic State. He was also an expert on these issues. His books were critically acclaimed. His book, The Ascendance of Israel's Radical Right, won Israel's 1992 Michael Landau Prize for the best political science book. His last book, Brother Against Brother, which was about Israeli extremism and violence, was a finalist in the 1998 National Jewish Book Award in the category of Israel. Professor Sprinzak also served as an advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin on these issues. He taught for 30 years at the Hebrew University before he moved to the faculty. He became actually the founding dean of the Lauder School. And he was admired, beloved as a teacher. He had a very unique personality, very open. He was very accessible. A winning personality, really. Wonderful sense of humor, very charismatic. And I know it for a fact because I was one of his students. So he died on November 8th, 2002, following months of illness, and he at the age of 62. And he left behind his wife, Ricky, 4 children, Sefi, David, Ophir, and Omil, two grandchildren, and a mother. So this event is held in his memory. And, of course, we'll always remember him here, especially at this school. So with that, let me turn to the subject of the workshop. Again, let me welcome our panelists. The way that we'll structure the workshop, we have 3 hours, which is actually great because for those of you who attended the first 2 days of the conference, sometimes we had to rush through the presentations, but we'll have a lot of time here, opportunities to get also to involve your questions, your input. In the first, so we'll divide this time into 2 parts. In the first hour and a half, we will have the formal presentations of the speakers. We'll then have a 10-minute break, grab some coffee, and then when we come back, we will have a Q&A session, which will incorporate some of my questions, but mostly the questions that I'm sure you will have. Let me just start maybe by setting the stage a little bit and offering some of my own comments, and perhaps some of you wonder, what the rationale is for this workshop. So, when we look at terrorism studies as a field, I think it is fair to say that until a few years ago, maybe until 9/11 certainly, the bulk of the writing on terrorism has really focused on organizations, on formal terrorist organizations. In fact, the modern study of terrorism, and Brian Jenkins, who has just walked in, can attest to that because he's one of the founders of the modern field, the modern study of terrorism, which began in the late 1960s, is very closely tied to the emergence of small terrorist groups in the West. The existing literature, I believe, tends to view these terrorist organizations as relatively formal organizations with clearly defined missions, a hierarchical structure, perhaps a headquarters, and so forth. The predominant view that terrorism is carried out mainly by terrorist organizations has become more problematic over time. Empirically, terrorist organizations are only one type of actor among a growing diversity of actors that are involved in terrorism. In addition to that, informal terrorist actors, so in addition to the formal terrorist organizations, informal terrorist actors, meaning actors other than formal organizations, are playing increasingly prominent roles in terrorism. Now, informal actors that engage in acts of terrorism are not unitary, right? But they can take a variety of forms, and of course the rise of the internet has further complicated these various forms that these actors can take. But they can include, for example, lone wolves. They can also include terrorist entrepreneurs, right, which we can think of as highly capable and innovative terrorist masterminds who have made every effort to maintain their independence, right? So they're not necessarily working for formal organizations. People like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, right, who had an independent idea to come up with the planes operation, which was subsequently adopted by an organization, by Al-Qaeda, right? So it's also a form of cooperation, really, between a terrorist entrepreneur and an organization. And we have, of course, loose networks or informal networks. So underlying the recognition, oops, let me just add this slide 1 second. Amber, what did you say?
Already open at the bottom.
Oh, I see. This one. So we can think of it maybe using this illustration, right? So I think that one of the ways in which we can look at the different actors or agents, we can also think of it in terms of agents or actors of terrorism, is to look really at a spectrum of actors, right? That ranges from more informal actors towards more formal actors, right? And this framework, right, helps us to put into perspective, right, that we have perhaps the most informal actors, such as lone wolves, on the one hand, going all the way to the more formal actors, such as terrorist organizations or states on the other end, right? And if you're looking, of course, at a group like ISIS, right, these are not independent categories. There's an overlap between these categories, right? So if you look at a group like the Islamic State, for example, you can argue that they're somewhere at the intersection between an organization and a state, right? And other groups, of course, are at other intersections. So in this workshop, what we'll do is we'll focus on the informal actors, so the lone wolves and the terrorist entrepreneurs, and the loose and informal networks. The other workshop, which is taking place right now, looks more at the terrorist organizations. And we also have a workshop on states. Now, why do informal networks matter? And here, I'm going to focus mostly on loose networks as opposed to lone wolves. But let me just throw up a few ideas of why I believe it's important to look at informal or loose networks. Informal networks matter because they have a number of unique benefits, according to network scholars. First, informal terrorist networks can emerge virtually anywhere and any time, which means that they can hamper government efforts to counter radicalization. They can emerge from criminal groups, in prisons, from student associations. They can emerge in study groups that form around radical mosques, and of course, increasingly over the internet. Secondly, networks are particularly agile. and adaptive, because unlike formal organizations, they are relatively unencumbered by layers of administrative red tape. And this can affect a variety of activities that such informal networks involve in, from attracting new members to establishing new ties to other actors, and from overcoming counterterrorism hurdles all the way to planning attacks. A third advantage is that small informal networks with particularly dense ties between the nodes, which applies to many of the contemporary small networks of the global jihad, can streamline communication between their members. On the one hand, this can speed up information processing and learning within the informal networks, and so it can bolster these networks' survivability in a hostile environment. On the other hand, these networks are able to spread ideas and information more easily outside of the networks, to individuals and to other networks. In other words, this very structure really enables cooperation between a range of terrorist actors. This also increases scalability for these networks, meaning the ability for these networks to grow sideways and attract more members. But it can also affect the proliferation of certain tactics and ideology. Actually, just last year, or 2 years ago, I think last year actually, Alexander Evans participated in a workshop on global jihad, and he pointed out in a workshop that we had during last year's conference that the spurt in suicide bombings in Afghanistan in 2005 and 2006, for example, it spread to Pakistan within a year exactly because of networks, through networks. He also mentioned that the rapid spread, for example, of the use of the flag of the so-called Islamic State was similarly enabled by networks. Networks, therefore, have superior capacities in terms of diffusing tactics, ideas, innovations, and thereby advancing the promotion of their strategic and ideological goals. Last but not least, informal networks are relatively robust. So this is in large part a result of the decentralization. Informal terrorist networks do not only operate clandestinely, but they're usually dispersed, which complicates efforts to identify the key actors, the hubs, the central nodes, and that makes them relatively immune to decapitation, when compared to formal terrorist organizations. So with these brief introductory remarks, and I hope that we'll be able to, I'm sure that we'll be able to discuss many of these issues, which are contended. Right, some of these issues are actually debated. There are some people who would argue that networks do not necessarily have advantages over organizations. Right, that's an important question, which I hope we'll talk about. So with that, let me start introducing the speakers. Actually, what I will do is I'll introduce the speakers one by one, and we'll go in alphabetical order. Our first speaker is going to be, and I'll ask all the speakers to keep their remarks to between 12 and 15 minutes. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, whom I hope many of you have had a chance to hear his presentation yesterday. He's the senior fellow in the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. He's also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University in the U.S. and one of the most inspiring thinkers on Al-Qaeda and global jihad. So we're very, very happy to welcome you back, David.
Thank you. And leave that slide up.
Okay.
No, it's the first time in over a year that I've asked someone to leave a PowerPoint slide up. So lone wolf terrorism is undoubtedly increasing, kind of. It depends on how you define lone wolf terrorism. And I think that as we get into the cyber realm, it actually becomes a much more difficult question as to what is increasing. In general, we define lone actor terrorism or lone wolf terrorism as terrorism where there's a single perpetrator as opposed to a conspiracy. We tend to think of those perpetrators, when they're lone actors, as being physically absent from other conspirators. For those who are familiar with the online environment, you'll understand right away how this is complicated. But let's look at the statistics first. By the past decade, lone wolf terrorism, lone actor terrorism, had been increasing for several decades. There's a very good study written by the Australian scholar Ramon Spaij, in which he looks at lone wolf terrorism by decades. If you look at from the 1970s through 2010, you had an average of about just over 4 lone wolf terrorist attacks per year across 15 Western countries. Now, by the past decade, that is 2000 through 2010, this number had risen. Across those 15 countries, you had an average of 7.3 lone wolf attacks per year. And this is across all ideological types, including jihadist terrorism, right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, single-issue terrorism, and the like. Now, going to last year, you had a massive spike in what we tend to define as lone wolf terrorism. That is, for lone wolf terrorist attacks that were inspired by one single group, not even in one ideological type, by one single group, the Islamic State, you had more than the yearly average for the previous decade. I mean, you had this undeniable spike in lone wolf terrorism that occurred last year. And the reason why is quite simple. It's the Islamic State's mastery of social media as a device to mobilize people to act. That's what social media has been so good at. And the reason why is because, looking at and I thought Assaf's remarks were quite good, looking at this schema of different types of terrorism, generally terrorism studies had focused on loose and informal networks and everything to the right of it. And the reason why is because, in general, terrorism tends to be a group thing. To get someone to carry out an act as extreme as terrorism, where they might lose their life and they probably will lose their freedom for the rest of their life, tends to take a group who can reinforce someone's extreme ideas, who can spur them on to action, and a group that won't let them back out. Now, what we've had over the course of the past few years, but spiking last year, is social media doing a very good job of playing the role of that group. That is, people will be online, medium like Facebook or Twitter, where there's this sense of immediacy. You can get to know people through those mediums, even if you don't meet face-to-face. Online relationships are not only no less real than physical relationships, but psychological studies in this domain have shown that relationships often deepen more quickly online. That's because the online environment is very low risk. That is, if there's something that you care about that's significantly outside the norm, and let's say in this case, jihadism, then, if you're in kind of if you go to class and you're like, hey, look, I'm a committed jihadist, you probably will find you don't have any friends, right? You're not going to be the most popular kid in school, depending on where you are. But if you're on Twitter and you're like, yeah, I'm a jihadist, yeah, you'll turn some people off, but you'll find other jihadists and your relationships will deepen quickly. And so I think especially when the way you define yourself falls far outside the norm, relationships can deepen more quickly online. So you have these online relationships on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere, which have been mobilizing people to action. Essentially, this is why I said that lone wolf terrorism is definitely increasing, kind of, because how you define the online environment isn't very clear. The traditional way of defining it would be to look at this spike in attacks and say, definitely, we've had a spike in lone wolf terrorism. Another way of looking at it is to put it one bubble to the right, that these aren't actually lone wolf terrorist attacks, but rather they're loose, informal networks, but loose and informal networks that are occurring in the online environment where there isn't actually physical contact. You can make an argument for either of those, but the point being that because of the dynamics of social media, and because of particularly ISIS's mastery of this medium, we're seeing lone actor attacks where that lone actor doesn't have physical contact with other co-conspirators increasing. That's the world we live in. Now, what I want to talk about is the solution set. I framed the problem. I want to frame the solution a little bit because I think within the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see a revolution in online CVE, combating violent extremism efforts. I'm not saying this will solve the problem. and I'll explain why it won't, but it will create a different dynamic than we have today. What I think we're going to see, what I am certain we will see, is a revolution in platform-based CVE efforts. Now, what we need to know at the outset, and I'll explain what platform-based CVE is in a second, but what tech companies, so the reason why we're going to see this revolution in platform-based CVE is because tech companies, which just 2 or 3 years ago thought of the fact that their platforms are being used to mobilize people for violence as not their problem, they're starting to take it seriously. 2 or 3 years ago, and even less than that really, these platforms would have very responses to this problem set that were unworthy of what was actually going on. They'd say, well, if a phone is used to phone in a death threat, do you penalize the phone company? Well, of course not. But when people say it's a problem that your platform is being used to mobilize people to kill, they're not necessarily saying you'll face legal consequences, but rather this is happening and it's your tool that's allowing it, and you need to think about what you can do to solve this problem set. In 2015, tech companies, for the most part, are starting to understand that their platforms are being used to mobilize people to undertake illegal activities and to kill, and in the case of ISIS, to enslave and to carry out genocide. And increasingly, they've come around to the idea that they also need to be part of the solution. And thus, you're going to see tech firms thinking about platform-based CVE efforts. Now, at the outset, one thing that these companies need to think about, which, in my view, they aren't sufficiently, is what the ethics of their community are. So let's point to an experiment that Facebook ran. It hit the news fairly recently. They ran a mood experiment. The mood experiment was you alter what people are seeing in their feed. You alter the algorithm a bit to make some feeds full of happier content, some feeds full of less happy content, and see what the effect is on the mood of Facebook users. Now, when it hit the news that they were doing that, it caused a massive backlash. How dare you interfere with our algorithms? What tech companies need to think about is several things. What is the ethics of their community with respect to people who are spurring others to kill via their platform? Do they face a problem with their community of users for that? Secondly, to what extent do they have free rein to pull down profiles? Profiles of Islamic State supporters, of white supremacists, of other kinds of extremists. And third, to what extent do they have the ability, with respect to the ethical views of their community, to change the algorithms of certain users so that their content does not operate in the same way as other content? The reason they need to think these through is because any tech company that tries to get involved in CVE efforts could face the same problem that Facebook did, where they alter an algorithm to try to get a result or to try to understand something better, and the community of users feels violated. The reason why that's a problem for these companies is because when you think about the tech firms that have arisen in the past 15 to 20 years, they're really dependent upon being user-facing, and they're dependent upon people liking them. Right? Think about Facebook, think about Google, think about Twitter. Their users don't pay to use these services. They're designed that way. The profitability of the companies comes from the fact that people see these as an intimate part of their lives and can't do without them. And so the value of the company comes from the fact that people want to use this free service. If you violate community ethics, you can find that your user base drops off, and every company is very afraid of this. So that's why they need to, at the outset, think about what the ethics of their community is. But let's talk about the power of algorithms. So you're on Facebook, and you're really interested in how President Obama was born in Kenya. Okay, so you're clicking through this link about how President Obama was definitely born in Kenya, and his birth certificate is totally, totally fake. And so below it, you have other news articles that pop up in your Facebook feed. And the other news articles will be, Obama is totally a Kenyan Muslim. Obama wants to commit genocide against all white people, or whatever, right? Like, you'll have other similar genres pop up. But it doesn't have to work that way. right? That's not inevitable. You can, instead of reinforcing the viewpoint of the user, you can challenge it, right? Instead of, President Obama's birth certificate is totally fake, you might get an article on reasons why President Obama's birth certificate is real, right? If you're an ISIS supporter and you're clicking through on ISIS is totally awesome and they're totally on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, you might have instead, a link come up that says, ISIS is Khawarij, right? You might have something that challenges your viewpoint. So right now, the default of most social media that depends upon algorithm is to reinforce a viewpoint because they want to give you something that you're interested in. And so the default of the algorithm is to place that within your viewpoint. You can instead alter it and challenge someone's viewpoint. This is platform-based CVE, right? This is platform-based CVE because what it's doing is someone who's on a path to becoming more radical, it's instead providing them alternative views and getting social media to work in a different way. Now, Facebook is unlikely to do this. At least they will not be a leader in this industry, in my view, because they're so freaked out from the result of their mood experiment. But I think other tech companies are going to explore in this area. Another area where I think there might be more exploration, where there should be, involves takedowns. Right now, one of the biggest ways that Twitter and Facebook as well deals with extremist content is taking it down. Facebook is better at this than Twitter, though not perfect. So I would describe takedowns as similar to the U.S. drone strike program, with less deadly results, but similar imprecision that allows a network to regenerate. So if you look at the way ISIS propaganda circulates online, you usually have people who are hubs, for distribution of information, or who will connect different users and the like. And in general, the takedowns focus on two kinds of people. One is extremist trolls, the people who for no reason will pop up in your Twitter feed and say, that ISIS is great, or usually it's a little bit more obnoxious than that. But so those people get taken down because, as a matter of course, usually at least when that happens to me, I'll just report them just to disrupt them a little bit, and they'll get taken down. The other is the hubs. There's a lot of takedown of hubs, but online ISIS networks on Twitter and elsewhere have shown the ability to regenerate. And that's because of users on the periphery. People who will give what's called shout-outs, where you show that so-and-so whose account got taken down is now back. And this is what Junaid Hussein's new account is, for example. And that's a way that you can regenerate the networks, through shout-outs, through redirects. All of these allow the networks to be basically intact because we have a hub-based targeting system. Now, if instead you had counter-network principles used, and an entire online network, all of it, including people at the periphery taken down at once, suddenly you're in a different ballgame. I would hypothesize that would be a much more effective way to target ISIS's online networks, to use counter-network principles. My basic point is that when you look at CVE efforts in the online sphere, they have to date not been very creative. There have been things like the State Department gets online and Twitter fights with ISIS, which is novel, but it's not all that effective. It's when tech companies and people who've had the ingenuity to help make these platforms popular in the first place, and who have the ability to do interesting things that are almost an organic part of your environment, like change the algorithm a little bit to challenge your viewpoint from time to time. It's when these things happen that I think we'll start to see new possibilities open. Now, it's not going to solve the problem. And one reason it's not going to solve the problem is because technology is developing so rapidly, and the use of the online space is developing so rapidly, that you're going to have a pendulum that for some time is swinging in one direction and another. New platforms are going to be created constantly. Look at, for example, Just Paste It, which is used now by ISIS as a major hub for posting their statements. New platforms will be created. New developments will sometimes swing the pendulum towards ISIS or other violent extremists, and sometimes can swing them back towards the CVE community. Things will be in flux. But the important point is that when you get creativity, the kind of creativity that really brought us these mediums and these platforms in the first place, that is brought to CVE efforts, then we'll have a different ballgame, and one where online CVE has a better chance. And that, to me, is one of those big hopes in the next 2 to 3 years that is going to not solve the problem of violent extremism online, but at least change the game. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, and that's exactly the reason why we keep inviting you back. It was extremely thought-provoking and out of the box. And it also, one of the things I wanted to mention in that regard is that, you really talk about, your remarks also reflect the idea that, we cannot look at these actors, at the actors of terrorism, in isolation. We have to look at them in their context with a broader structure or with the environment, right? And so it's in this interaction between the actors and the environment in which they are situated, in which they also affect. Right, they're affected by the environment, and they also affect it in return, and that's something which I think, in many ways, our conference this year is set up in a way where I think in the afternoon session or in the morning session we dealt with a broader environment, and now we're kind of looking at the actors, but you cannot really separate the two. So, just a few remarks. There are some seats in the front here, like 8-9 seats. So those of you who are sitting, on the steps, you can move forward if you want. I forgot earlier to thank Amber Ederich, who is has been my wonderful intern, for her support in organizing the workshop. She's a Fletcher ML Malt grad. So, okay, we'll move on to the next speaker, Dr. Randall Rogan. Somebody yesterday referred to the returnees to our conference as lifers. Another lifer. Randall is a professor of communication and the interim dean at the college at Wake Forest University. And his presentation is titled "Embracing Violent Jihad, the Primal Motive in the Lone Wolf." His research program is a forensic discourse analysis of crisis negotiations and author identification. His research also focuses on the communication-based analysis of the terrorist narrative, with particular attention to the discourse of jihadism, its foundational jurisprudence, and the ideology for jihad against democracy. It's great to have you back. I'll just take the slide down. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Assaf. And it's a pleasure and honor to be back once again to ICT, to this incredible conference and gathering of international experts dealing with critical issues that we are all facing as we proceed and advance into the 21st century. And it's really my honor as well and pleasure to be part of a really esteemed august group of panelists. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective here this afternoon from what you might have anticipated or be thinking about. Yes, I look at communication of negotiation and terrorist communication, but today I'm going to drill down into something at the individual level that I think has significant implication and application both for the individual as a lone wolf, has implication for individuals such as Eric Rudolph, extreme right wing, Ted Kaczynski, and others. There's a theme that I have recognized in the panels and the presentations that I've heard throughout the conference about how we counteract. What are the counter narratives or the narratives that we can construct to address the potential recruitment and enticement of individuals to become lone wolves or even to engage in group activity? And I'm going to take an approach today, this afternoon, where I interrogate this phenomenon of violent extremism from a spiritual, philosophical, and social scientific theoretical perspective. After more than 27 years of engaging with the FBI in hostage negotiation, threat assessment, and profiling, most significantly in identifying Ted Kaczynski as the Unabomber, I have found what I think right now, right today, doesn't preclude me changing my mind tomorrow or later this afternoon or flying back to the States or in a week or in a year. I have found what I think is a primal motive for violent extremist behavior. I can't take claim for it. It's come out of my reading of older research, scientific, academic work, and some contemporary work. Some of you might be familiar with it as I begin to share it. It is ultimately what Ernest Becker, the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, calls the worm at the core. So let me begin. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. John 1. This simple 12-word statement testifies to the significant power of words and language. For what is said and what is written not only informs and conveys meaning and sentiment as when we greet someone, but also functions to direct behavior. The word can stir men's souls to motivate them to act. According to Eric Hoffer, it is the man of words who creates change, who creates mass movements, and who creates revolutions, the consequences of which can be social justice, mutual respect, and unification, but also discrimination, hate, violence, genocide, evil. This morning we heard a conversation in one of the morning panels, morning sessions, about Syndrome E, Syndrome Evil. Therefore, we need to understand how words are used to frame reality and how that frame functions as a source of power to create mass movements. Yet this knowledge of framing and function alone is insufficient. We must strive to understand the potential psychological motivational force compelling mankind, individuals, to engage in violent acts toward others as propelled by the Word. For this reason, we must seek to understand the Word for its existential implications. For the Word is at the core of humankind's struggle with mortal existence and death. And through the Word, man seeks acknowledgement and immortality. So allow me to elaborate. The Word, as described in the Bible, is the mechanism by which God created the universe and humankind. As such, this use of the Word was the first expression of acknowledgement, a theory developed by my colleague at Wake Forest University, Professor Michael Hyde, around acknowledgement. So I'm drawing on some of his work. Creating this act created the space for creation itself and for all other subsequent expressions of acknowledgement. By this act, God acknowledged the universe and all that is within it. But more significantly, God's acknowledgement was the creation of man and woman. But God's creation of man and woman was not sufficient, for according to the Bible, they ate of the tree of knowledge, which God forbade them to do. We read in Genesis 2, 16, 17, the Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. And this, my friends, this is the fateful act that has plagued humankind since creation, as man and woman realize their human mortality by eating from the tree, thereby prompting man to seek God's acknowledgement ever since. In other words, to reestablish the God-man connection that was forever severed at the tree. We find evidence of this in almost all religious texts. This quest to reconnect manifests in the myriad examples found in the Bible, Quran, Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist teachings, as man has searched for the acknowledgement of being from God. So to provide a sense of meaning, purpose, value, and as a result of man's knowledge of his own mortality, thus making this an existential conundrum for man, as man asks of God, Where art thou? And hoping to hear God say, here I am. That re-acknowledgement, that reconnection. This is the spiritual religious basis for what I'm talking about today. But there is science and scientific research that has focused on this existential conundrum for humankind. So allow me to shift gears now from the spiritual religious to the scientific, social scientific, as it implicates individuals who engage in acts of violent extremism, whether as part of groups, loose networks, or on their own, as it implicates acts of hate and violence. According to the cultural anthropologist Ernst Becker, humans are the only animal with the ability to think about past, present, and future. And it is the perseveration on our future existence that produces a fear, terror, if you will, of our own death and mortality, impending death and mortality. This fear thereby generates a quest for immortality. As we come to a realization at life, the question posed, is this all there is? Is this all there is? To transcend our own death and to ascribe meaning and value to our existence in a seemingly meaningless and purposeless world. Furthermore, this fear of death is the basis of man's primal and singular motive to justify himself to be of primary value in the universe, to be of cosmic specialness, to make the most significant contribution to human existence, to be of ultimate usefulness to creation, of unshakable meaning, and thus to count, to be existentially heroic. And it's interesting, as we get to the concept of heroism, Monday's edition of the Jerusalem Post, the trick of acting heroically, of how important heroism is in human society, regardless of the culture. But there are implications here. Self-esteem is the manifestation of this primal motive, grounded within each culture's value system about what is meaningful and, yes, what it means to be a hero. What we've seen over time is being a hero typically means knowingly facing death and cheating it, taking on death and denying it, to then thereby be immortal in some way. Yet in the modern world, for most of us, we don't confront death. Most of us achieve this need for heroism and meaning and value by making money, owning houses, driving luxury automobiles, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry, our accomplishments, being somebody. Being somebody. Think about it. It's a marketing ploy if you realize it and you think about it and become conscious of the different attempts to make you feel like you're being somebody. Introductions, having access to the executive lounge at the hotel, having access to the special lounge in the airport, priority boarding for the plane, first class seating. You are not part of the masses. You are special. You stand out. Becker's thinking, then, his original thinking about this need for heroism, this existential conundrum, has been extended and elaborated into what is known as terror management theory. Terror management theory postulates because of humankind's fear-based perseveration on mortality, humans seek immortality in two important ways. Literal immortality, which is the belief that we live on after our deaths, in heaven with those we love and cherish, that we have a soul, that what we have is this physical being, this is not it. There is something more, so that we are promised some sense of literal immortality. If we have this realization, potential realization, this is it, folks. There's nothing more. Once you're gone, it's like before you were born. You don't know what existed. You don't know anything. You're not in existence anymore. The other is symbolic immortality. And symbolic immortality is by being remembered in some meaningful, tangible manner by what we accomplish in life and by being part of a cause that is greater than ourselves. And it's striving to realize something good and of value as defined by histories, by our individual cultural worldview, rather, to be heroic. Helping us to deal with this early existential conundrum early in our lives, we first rely upon our parents to provide us with a sense of security and safety. But as we get older, we come to realize that our parents are not the superhumans or heroes we thought they were. And we come to rely upon our cultural frames, our cultural norms, our worldviews to provide us with a sense of security, a sense of belonging, self-esteem that we seek so to feel as though we are part of something of value and that we can, as individuals, matter. So what does all this mean, this religious, spiritual, theoretical mumbo-jumbo, mean for understanding lone wolves or individuals who engage in violent extremism? First of all, lone wolves or individuals who engage in violent extremism, like all other humans, desire to fulfill their core need for primal cosmic significance. They seek acknowledgement as they confront reality of their own mortality, asking God in response, if you will, where are you? Think about it for a moment for yourselves. How many of us, when you find yourself in a liminal space, that space of transition, uncertainty, where things don't seem to make sense, you're not certain where to go in life, and you ask God, what will you have me do? What do you want me to do? How should I move forward? Asking God, where are you? Sadly, within their own socialized cultural worldview, and I say socialized, that's the one that they are assimilated into, individuals who engage in violent extremism, lone wolves, fail to realize the sense of cosmic meaning and acknowledgement that they seek, so they search for it from other sources. Ideologies, looking for that cultural worldview that resonates with their being, often finding that what they seek comes from groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others who respond to their asking, God, where are you? Looking out, searching, and who responds? ISIS, here I am. Organizations responding to this need of where are you? Here I am. Thereby acknowledging them as meaningful human beings, but more importantly, providing them with an alternative cultural worldview to their socialized cultural worldview, and thus providing them with a new lens or schema with which to understand the world and by which they can ascribe meaning to their world and their existence. A cultural worldview that helps them to realize their singular cosmic significance, so to live on after death, to be heroic. And of subscribing to the doctrine and dogma of groups like IS and other terror groups, they believe they are answering God's call for acknowledgement when God asks, where are you? Here I am. And the second point of how this applies, in a seemingly ironic and contradictory ways, individuals recruited into, say, a jihadi cultural worldview are directly confronting the terror, fear of their own death by killing and dying. Because we see in a jihadi cultural worldview clearly promises literal immortality. The promise for the shaheed, paradise, as well as symbolic immortality. This is realized as being part of a cause in the name of God, not merely some king, country, or government. So to summarize, as we seek to develop strategies and understand to violent extremism and the propaganda associated with the recruiting mechanisms, we must look beyond the simple thematic structures created for recruiting and look at how the narrative functions to address an existential need in the target of those messages. And then seek to produce narratives that bolster the cultural worldview that is positive and not hate-based. A positive narrative for heroism. Interestingly, in the United States, we have this already, but it doesn't apply to this phenomenon of violent extremism. Country music in the United States is replete with lyrics about how it is heroic to be a farmer, to be a working man, to be wearing a hard hat and using a hammer, to being a good father, to being a good husband, to doing what is right. Even ABC News had a little heroic narrative campaign going on with its Made in America, where they were making heroes out of American factory workers who were producing products that had the label Made in America. Take a trip back in time for a second. Those of you and part of my age cohort may remember this, but as we saw in the film, Steve Martin's comedic film, The Jerk, we all want to be somebody, right? He was somebody when he finally saw his name published in the phone book, and then somebody started shooting at him. We all want to be heroes. We all want to cheat death and realize immortality. We all want to be of cosmic significance. We all want our lives to have meaning and value. We want to be existentially acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Randall Rogan, for very, very interesting remarks. By the way, for those of you who are interested in terror management theory, we have many students here. We have really one of the world's leading experts on TMT here, Gilad Hirschberger. Maybe some of you took his classes. And certainly, Randall, your insights, they strike a right chord with me. And I think that really one of the greatest challenges we have is, how can we offer kind of a positive identity in the West that can, detract or that can prevent people from seeking such an identity, in Iraq or Syria. Okay, our next speaker, an old friend of mine, is Yoram Schweitzer, who is the director of the Terrorism and Low-Intensity Conflict Research Program at the Institute for National Security Studies. He had a long, distinguished career in the Israeli intelligence community, as well as in the academic world. He also had positions here at ICT, where he was, and also at the IDF. He was the head of the Counter-International Terror Section. He was a member of the task force dealing with Israeli MIAs at the Prime Minister's office. And he has written extensively on terrorism, and he's really in my mind, one of the most insightful experts on terrorism, certainly in Israel, but really around the world. So glad to have you back, Yoram.
Thank you, Assaf. It's good to be here. In order to make some sense in this chaotic world, unstable region, to try to guess or to make an educated guess of the environment in which terrorism in future will be, one needs maybe to try to go to history, not long history, to try to make some sense, and with the knowledge that history not necessarily repeats itself. So I think trying to find out what we are against may send us to Afghanistan, mainly to both experiences of Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, and even more so the Afghan alumni of the second generation and the third generation that arrived to Afghanistan after 96, when the Taliban seized control over the state. And when you look at the way the cadre of Afghan alumni found themselves after this experience, we saw that they chose few venues. Most of them went back to their countries of origin and almost immediately elevated the level of violence in their countries. We have seen it, not yet, but we have seen some signs of it even from those Syrian alumni. Another venue was that they were seeking and looking for and found Islamic causes to fight for. I think we have also seen some of the Syrian alumni going to various countries of origin. Most of them are still in Syria, but some went back and found themselves in those battlefields. Some joined Al-Qaeda. Those who were selected because of their proficiency remained with Al-Qaeda. We haven't seen it yet in the Islamic State, but it may be possible that they will do this as well. And I think in those days, the most significant phenomena was that those Afghan alumni joined and basically consolidated some free networks. And we can just mention few examples. I think the most notable one was of Ramzi Yusuf, who went to the United States and later on to the Philippines. And after he was caught, his uncle basically joined Al-Qaeda, which he didn't belong in those initial days, and eventually was the one who became the operative commander of the 9/11. So these are the examples that we have seen up till now. Another important and significant topic I think we should pay attention to is the difference between when we talk about the individuals, the lone wolves. When we look at Al-Qaeda hardcore, the organization, I think it was quite easy to see the difference between those who were inspired by Al-Qaeda, indoctrinated by Al-Qaeda, trained by Al-Qaeda, and sent loose and went to carry out attacks. You can mention Ahmed Rasim, for example. And I think also a guy that we thought that we got rid of, but he popped up again. And I'm talking about Muhammad Jamal. Jamal had a network. He was trained by Al-Qaeda, by Abu Zubaydah, like Ahmed Rassam, and went back to his country of origin, tried to have this kind of network that was planning attacks in Paris and mainly in Belgium, and he was apprehended. And this Ahmed Jamal now is the mentor of the Kwashi brothers. And he still, even though he was in jail and later on, I think he was released, but when he was in jail, he qualified new cadres of terrorists. And when Al-Qaeda, the hardcore Al-Qaeda, planned attacks as an organization, not too many, but all of them were very highly skilled, planned, supervised, and executed. And there is a great difference between groups and terror organizations that are planning terrorist attacks and sending people to carry them out with these loose networks or even individuals that are trying to plan. And now, today, in our world, this crazy world with this developed social media, we see that individuals that in the bad old times, even before Al-Qaeda was conceived, but even in the 70s, when you have to at least attack, a massive attack in counters in airports or to blow up airliners, today you can just shoot with one rifle and make a lot of noise and get a lot of publicity, which is the hardcore of the aims of terrorism. So I think we should notice these differences, and when we are talking about these lone wolves, etc., although again, in life, even if somebody is belonging to a terrorist organization, it was very well planned, it may cause small damage. And sometimes an individual can cause a lot of problem. But basically, the fact that up till now we haven't seen very professional acts of terrorism by groups, only individuals operating, I think it's a good sign, and we have to take it into proportion. Another component which will be, and by the way, it's important to mention that up till now we haven't seen any terrorist attacks that was carried out by and initiated and supervised by ISIS. And I don't address Namush and all these kind of people if they had some communication with people in Syria. We haven't seen up till now even single terrorist attack that was carried out by the Islamic State. I think we will see. It's almost inevitable that all these energies that are accumulated in Syria are not going to explode in the West and in other places in the world, and we have seen some of it in the Arab world already. Another element which is important, I think, to pay attention and will determine the way things go in future is this brutal rivalry between and competition for power and for cadre and for constituency between Al-Qaeda and its alliances and ISIS and its alliances. This will definitely determine the future of terrorism. Both of them are competing for constituency, and they are competing for power and power image, and it will affect us all, not only in substance but also in formation of terrorist organization, terrorist networks, terrorist individuals that will be sent, and small cells as well. I would like to get into two examples that I think to some extent give us some sense of what we are up against. And I would like to go to Egypt. And these differences and these shifts with affiliations, with loyalties among the groups. When Baghdadi made his declaration of the establishment of the Islamic State in mid-2014, and more so when he appointed himself to become Khalif, he immediately forced all the organizations, individuals, but organizations that belong or consider themselves to identify with the global jihadi movement to make a choice. It's like Yoshua bin Nun in the Bible, and it's like Bush, with the slight differences, who said, are you with us or against us? And they had to decide. And it wasn't very easy, but because of his gesture, he forced people to decide. And we have seen all the dynamics that are still occurring in the global jihadi movement. And if we go to Egypt and to Sinai, we have seen the group, the most notorious group there is Ansar Bet al-Maqdas, today called Wilayat Sinai. When they announced their appearance in a video and claimed responsibility for certain attacks in Sinai and on the attack against Israel, they pledged loyalty and gave the adherence to Zawahiri, and of course they mentioned bin Laden as well. And we have seen that it took a while until they merged with or made themselves subjected affiliates of the Islamic State. But I want to talk about very slightly about networks that are still operative in Sinai and in Egypt itself. There was, when the revolution occurred in Egypt, quite many old veteran terrorists escaped from prison. One of them was Muhammad Jamal. Muhammad Jamal was an officer, we can call it like this, an officer in the Egyptian Islamic Jihad working under Zawahiri. When he escaped from prison, he contacted Zawahiri and offered his services to Zawahiri. And Zawahiri sent him a letter and gave him the order to operate and to train networks in Sinai and in Libya. And he did so. And he also used other veterans who escaped from prison. So this Muhammad Jamal was arrested around 2012. He is considered to be one of the trainers of people who were involved in the assassination of the American ambassador in Libya, and he was jailed. Other of his accomplices continued their operation, and those days Ansar Bet al-Maqdas was already established, and they were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And now we are in September 2013, when there was a very audacious attack against the Minister of Defense, Interior Minister in Egypt, and this operation was attributed to Ansar Bet al-Maqdas, who was at these times had to decide whether they belonged to Al-Qaeda or to ISIS, although it wasn't yet a full schism between the two. And Ansar Bet al-Maqdas claimed responsibility, and the suicide bomber who carried out this operation was part of Jamal network. Now we are moving forward, and there are other attacks in Egypt, in the Libyan border, attack against soldiers, killing 22 soldiers coming from Libya. Another of these gentlemen who belong to the Al-Qaeda affiliated networks by the name of Hisham Hishmawi, another Egyptian officer who went Salafi jihadist and escaped from prison and escaped from Egypt and went to Libya. He was accused of these attacks. And now in 2015, July, he appeared in a video with Zawahiri appearing in the same video, and he pledged allegiance to Zawahiri, meaning that he belonged to Al-Qaeda, and he was responsible, according to Egyptian, for the assassination attempt against the Minister of Interior and for the Libyan attack and for others. He announced that he is the leader of a group called Murabitun. So you see the Ansar Bet al-Maqdas abandoning Al-Qaeda, choosing to affiliate itself with the Islamic State, and a guy who was a major trainer and qualified some of the people that were carrying out attacks in Sinai under the Ansar Bet al-Maqdas auspices, now went out and affiliated himself with Al-Qaeda. And he is considered by the Egyptian responsible for certain attacks, including the attack against the General Attorney in June or July 2015. So you see these fluctuations and gestures and moves between organization, between affiliations. Another example from a different kind is in Europe. And I think you are all familiar with the incident that occurred in the Charlie Hebdo and in the grocery there. And you see these three members of a network, because there was a connection between Kouachi brothers and Kalibuli. And the Kouachi brothers were trained, sometimes at least one of them was trained in Saudi Arabia under the AKAP, which belonged to the affiliation, the alliances of Al-Qaeda. And not only them announced that they belong to Al-Qaeda, AKAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, but also the group itself claimed responsibility. I still don't know, maybe others know. I don't know what connections AKAP had with the actual attack. I'll address it at the end when I address this, when I close. I made my closing remark talking about how we define the lone wolves and these networks. So you have Kouachi brothers who affiliate themselves with AKAP, Al-Qaeda alliances, and you have Kalibuli who operated parallelly to the brothers and wanted to release them when they were under siege, and he announced himself to be operating on behalf of the Islamic State. He identified with the Islamic State. His girlfriend went to Syria. He wasn't sent by the Islamic State, as I mentioned before. No attack that I know of that was initiated and supervised by the Islamic State. So you have these cooperation with two individuals that each of them identify with another component of the global jihadi movement. Both of them are bitter enemies at this stage. One comment on the, which may contribute to later our discussion, as we discussed it beforehand, about this issue of lone wolf. Lone wolf, almost by definition, first of all, the classical lone wolf is the one that between his right ear and left ear, if he has brains, contemplate and decide that he wants to become a terrorist and to do the act by itself. So maybe the first component is to be alone, to do it alone. The Kouachi brothers cannot be lone wolves. The Chernayev brothers cannot be lone wolf. But let's also remember that even Richard Colvin Reed, the shoe bomber, the old shoe bomber, and the Tunisian Nizar who blew up the synagogue in Jerba in 2002, is not a lone wolf. And Muhammad Abu Taleb, the Nigerian guy, is not also a lone wolf, because all the last three examples that I gave had being supervised, sent, provided with money and logistical support. So they are not lone wolves, although they executed the operation by themselves. On the other hand, Breivik, the Norwegian guy, is a lone wolf. Even the Swedish guy, or the Iraqi guy who blew up, who made a suicide attack in Sweden in 2010, by himself, is a lone wolf. And Shahrazad in the Times Square is a lone wolf, although here we have a small problem. That's my definition, at least. Not obligatory to accept it. Because for me, if somebody carries out the operation by his own initiative, even though he was trained by somebody, like the Kouachi brothers, by definition, they are not lone wolves, but if there had been only one, and he was trained by AKAP in 2009 and carried out the operation 6 years later, and they did not have connections that supervised the operation and told him the target, not by the publication in Inspire, but they were aware of his operation, the time, and they gave him provided, which means that they accompanied him, then he would become, without it, he is a lone wolf to me. So I think we should try to decide who is a lone wolf. Of course, we have many examples today of lone wolves, let alone in Israel, but even in the United States, the guy in the train in Europe, the guy in Tennessee is a lone wolf. Hassan Nidal Malek to me is a lone wolf, although he was conversing with Aulaki. I think we should bear it in mind when we try to define this phenomenon. I think I'll stop here, and we'll discuss more things later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoram, also for reminding us at the end of the importance of terminology and definitions, which I happen to agree with your definition of lone wolves, or at least with what should not be considered a lone wolf. Next, we have Dr. Erroll Southers, who is the director of the Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies Program, Safe Communities Institute at the University of Southern California. His presentation is titled Foreign Fighter Recruitment Field Study. Dr. Southers was President Obama's first nominee for Assistant Secretary of the TSA, Transportation Security Administration. He was Governor Schwarzenegger's Deputy Director for Critical Infrastructure of the California Office of Homeland Security. He formerly served as Assistant Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence at the Los Angeles World Airports Police Department. Also previously worked as FBI special agent, SWAT team member, police officer, I believe. So really amazing background. And he's also a great friend of the ICT, teaches here in our master's program. It's great to have you back.
Thank you, Assaf. Let's see. So if you could fire me up here. So should I use the mouse? Oh, there we go. Yeah. Thanks.
You can use the mouse.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. So Assaf and David mentioned in the very beginning the notion of actors in the environment. And so I'm going to go outside of the box here of lone wolves and loose networks and talk about really what this dynamic is all about, which is adaptive adversaries. And when I think about things that have happened, particularly since 9/11, here and abroad, and adaptive adversaries, we have to ask ourselves the question, are they learning faster than we are? Assaf, thank you again for the the incredible introduction, but as you can see, I come from an operational background, much like Mordecai, like Brian Jenkins. I come from an operational background, and I prefer to at least humbly refer to myself as an academic practitioner. And having said that, I think it's very important that we engage in field research. I think it's very important that we get out and really engage with people who might be targeted for these movements or actually engage in these movements. I spent the majority of my local law enforcement career working gangs, and there is some symbiosis between gangs, cults, and terrorists. and their personal needs, their grievances, their social needs, their status. Those may decide they're going to be legacies. So what I'm going to share with you today is a study that I did about a year ago in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you don't know, Minneapolis has the largest Somali community outside of the country of Somalia. They've been through a whole host of activities over the last 7 years now, some of which we'll talk about in a moment. But I do want to talk about the fact that I went there trying to understand why the recruitment effort, why someone would leave the United States who was born here, and why someone would go to a country to fight that they have no connectivity to. So here's how this story begins. So I go to Minneapolis. Let's see. First, let me give you some research questions, then we'll talk about the actual beginning of this episode. But here were my questions when I went there. I wanted to know, how is ISIL recruiting in the Minneapolis community? Well, that wasn't a rhetorical question. We know they're doing that. The question was, how are they being successful? How's this resonating with American-born Somalis? What are the components of this process? Are there stages? Is it tailored? Is it customized? Is it a template, one size fits all? And then most importantly, what programs in the community are proving effective in halting, deterring, detecting, defending against recruitment or countering the messages that were coming across? Now, I do want to say this at the onset. I never met a more loyal, more dedicated group of Americans than the people in the Somali community. And I can tell you that there are places in the Somali community that if you're an al-Shabaab or ISIL sympathizer, it is not the place to go. And they know that. And they're staying away from those places. So the biggest deterrence we have in this effort of recruitment, at least in Minnesota, is the Somali community. Here are some core findings on the research. First of all, two assumptions that people seem to always make. That this issue of poverty and lack of social mobility is the reason that people decide to radicalize and depart. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are not despondent, poor, desperate, ignorant young men or women by any stretch. In fact, in most cases, the people that I've talked to there, who know people who left in 2008 and 2009, and those who have left this past year, found those individuals to be just the opposite. Very good students, incredibly social, athletes, very amiable, and then life changes for them. And that social media is ISIL's primary method of recruitment. Now, I'm going to not dispel a myth, but at least give you some food for thought with regards to how much social media really plays in the recruitment radicalization effort. I think that unfortunately, because we watch it so much and hear it so much, we think that people who have no notion or preconceived idea of being recruited go and sit in their bedroom, turn on their laptop, connect with somebody overseas, and decide to buy a plane ticket. And that is not what's happening. In fact, what I'm going to share with you are some things that are happening that may be particularly disturbing with regards to how social media does play a part, but it plays a smaller part than what you may think. So let me go back. So I go to Minnesota, and I always had to ask this question of the Somalis in Minnesota. I said, you come from sub-Saharan Africa. Why would you go to the coldest place in the United States to live? And I asked every single one of them that. And it was interesting because some of them, after coming from refugee camps in Kenya and other places, they would say, well, I went to San Diego, or I was in Texas or Florida. Why Minnesota? I was really pleased with what I did here. They said, you know, we have to tell you something. We didn't go through the experience that you went through here in the United States of being African American, being subjected to certain prejudices and racial issues that as you grew up you had to deal with. We didn't know that. We don't have that in Somalia. We came here, and the nicest people we met in the United States were in Minnesota. They took us for what we were. We got jobs. We went to school. They treated us nicely. We told our friends and relatives to come. I said, okay, well, that makes sense to me. So let's talk about what we've got in Minnesota. And this is a very brief, and you can, and by the way, this study's available. So I worked previously at a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence, the first one in the United States, called CREATE. It is the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. This study was funded by the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate. It is available to you. I'm going to give you a slice of it today as we talk about this dynamic of lone wolves and loose networks. You can see there And I use the term HVE, homegrown violent extremists, and I'll explain why in a moment. You can see the target age group there for people that were leaving Minnesota, 18 to 20, 21 to 26, prime. The majority demographic in Minnesota for Somalis is under the age of 30. So it's a target-rich environment if you're a recruiter. I use the term HVE because CVE, as I mentioned yesterday, is a new acronym that's getting a lot of traction. There are 3 quote-unquote CVE pilot cities in the United States: Boston, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Los Angeles, California. CVE has, in less than a year, already become synonymous with Muslim extremism only. And so the communities in those cities, of which this effort is being geared toward to reduce the risk of recruitment and radicalization, are pulling away from the program because they believe 2 things. One, they're being unduly profiled as a community that's going to do something nefarious. And 2, it's part of a larger government intelligence gathering effort. So I tend to use the term homegrown violent extremism because we don't only talk about Muslim extremism. We talk about extremisms based on 3 different ideologies: race, religion, and issue-oriented driven ideologies. And that way, everybody gets a fair shake. Everybody gets a chance for us to take a look at them. You can see there in 2008 and 2009, the blue line are those individuals that departed Minneapolis. The red line are total homegrown violent extremists in that city. 2008, 2009, you may recall, there was a mass exodus. But I shouldn't say that. Actually, it was a large group of young men who left in 2008, 2009 to join Al-Shabaab. And then it dropped off. What's really disturbing is since that time, the uptick you see last year between 2013 and 2014 are all departing Minneapolis for Syria. And as we've talked to parents there, we kept asking them, why is this happening? Why would they have any connectivity? I can tell you this, that on 2 occasions, the people that we talked to said that they had gotten the word through Twitter that the destination point if you leave Minneapolis is Syria. We're not going to Mogadishu anymore, we're going to Syria. Some of the findings. Unfortunately, ISIL has totally taken over the Al-Shabaab recruiting methodology and mechanism in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's been totally appropriated. We believe, and we trust you, that there is actually direct collaboration on the ground between Al-Shabaab, ISIS, those sympathizers, and their potential recruits. And they live and operate in the community. Let me just share with you the fact that these same sympathizers know when government agencies come into Minneapolis and will sit at those meetings under the guise of running youth programs to try to obtain federal funding when all they're doing is basically running an intelligence gathering effort for what the government is doing to stop the flow of people from leaving the city. Social media. What we found is that face-to-face interaction was a crucial and important part of the recruitment process for ISIL in the United States. And that actually social media, Twitter, Facebook, and other components are supporting that process. So they're using them in concert with each other. So it's not to say that someone can't go and sit in their bedroom and decide, after communicating with someone overseas 24 hours a day, that they might have this notion to leave. But in the instances and the people that we talked to, this was in fact not the case. They had ample opportunity and locations to speak to real sympathizers, real time, anytime, and we found those places in Minneapolis very easily. And they were having conversations about where we should go. I do want to say this, the last place they're going to have these conversations is in the mosque. They will not go to the mosque. The imams there, for whatever relationship that they have been able to form with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, anybody who comes in the mosque, not only in Minneapolis, I can speak for Los Angeles as well, and they suggest that they're dealing with the propensity or thought of becoming radicalized or leaving the United States, or there will be a phone call to that agency before they even leave the premises. So they are not going there. They're deliberately staying away from there. But there are plenty of locations in Minneapolis and other cities where they can go and there's face-to-face conversations are happening. Let me share this with you. Unfortunately, let me back up. I need to tell you a quick story, and then this will all make sense. So I went to Minneapolis. We didn't know anybody there. My partner, my research partner's name is Justin Heintz. Justin is white. He's an Islamic scholar. And I go there as a person of color, and for the Somali community, that worked for them. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But I get there the first night. The two of us get off a plane. It's the typical 5 degrees. I don't know what that is in centigrade, but it's 5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really cold in Minneapolis. We get there with a gentleman we've been communicating with by phone, by Skype, for months. We don't know him. And he's going to introduce us to someone that evening. We walk around to the back of a building near what's called Cedar Riverside, which is the high-rises in Minneapolis. And there's this little building. It's about the distance from here to this front row of people, about this wide. There's a light inside. There's 3 or 4 male subjects in there. There's 2 women standing in the back. It's got a little like pool hall type lamp. I sit down at a small table with a gentleman in front of me. He puts down a pad on the table. He puts down a pen. He leans forward and looks at me and says, "Who are you and what do you want?" Well, the first thing I thought was, I'm not armed. And the second thing I thought was, I don't know where I am, which is not in my genetics. I'm looking at Morty and Brian. They know exactly what I mean. It's not in our genes to do that. I was totally at their mercy. And I told them my background. I didn't leave anything out. I told them what we were there to do. I told them what we'd like to work on. And a couple things came through. And I'm saying this for some of my former students in here and some of the researchers. The first thing he said to us is, we're tired of being lab rats. We're tired of people coming in here to do studies, collect data, never sharing their reports, and never coming back. And I thought that was pretty enlightening. The second thing I found out was that he knew all about me and had worked for 12 years for the Saul Price Foundation in San Diego, California, which is the Saul Price who named the public policy school that I teach in. So, needless to say, he had done all of his homework. Once we passed that vetting that evening, and I found out later on he was a Klan leader, which made sense because after we met him, everybody we met and every place we went, it was almost as if we had had a pass for information. Because he had basically said, tell them what they need to know. These guys are going to help us. It was extremely useful. At the same time, we were trying to get to a woman and her family whose daughter had just left on August 21st. She was 19 years old. And after deliberations to the 11th hour, they finally allowed us to come to their house. We went to their house, met with Mom, the woman who departed, her sister and her brother, and some friends. Here's what happened. She's 19 years old. She's going to be a nurse. She's a model student. She leaves, graduates from high school, and all of a sudden she just shuts down. She decides she wants to learn more about the Quran. Her mom said, as a parent, I felt really proud, and at the same time, I was very concerned because how much is too much? She wasn't communicating with anybody except this one young man who had come into her life about 6 months before. She says she's going to a wedding shower on Friday. She goes to the wedding shower. That evening, she calls home and says, I'm going to probably stay with some friends tonight. If I don't come home, I'll be home tomorrow. 2 weeks before she leaves, which was the Sunday, and the family got a phone call from her saying, Mom, I'm in Syria. 2 weeks before she leaves, what we found out is all of her social media had been shut down. Twitter, Facebook. Now, if you're anything like my 15-year-old daughter, anybody that age who's shutting down all their social media, something's desperately wrong. And this is what her brother told us. 2 days before she leaves, about $2,000 to $3,000 goes into a bank account. And then, of course, she goes to the wedding shower on Friday. We don't hear from her till Sunday, and she's gone. About 2 days after she gets there, there's a text message after the phone call to say, I'm staying in a place with other women. We can't leave. I get walked out to an internet cafe for communication, and I'm basically just sitting here. I'm fine. I'm healthy. I'm safe, but I'm just here. And then every 3 weeks or so now, we hear that there's regular communication. Now, the moral to this story is a couple things. Number one, obviously, not a poor, despondent, desperate young woman. A woman who had a future, a woman who wanted to be a nurse, had a career. Second of all, she is now saying things like, I wish I hadn't left, but gone. And so a very interesting story. Is this part of a pattern? We don't know. But what's really sad is every time we went to Minnesota, we learned of another family who had someone leave who hadn't told the authorities they had left, because they believed if they told the authorities, they'd never see them again. So I'm saying this to you to say we have no idea how many people have left the States or any idea how many people have come back. And so as was heard earlier about the inevitable ISIL attack on any country that's represented in the audience today, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I'll close with this. There are some things that are working. Youth engagement's huge there. I met soccer players. In fact, I'm going back in 2-3 weeks. We're going to take some shoes. Sorry if I sound a little biased. All the soccer players are now wearing University of Southern California T-shirts. But we're going to take back some shoes to the soccer players. And I had soccer players who said some very interesting things to me. They said on our second trip there, we can't believe you came back. And I said, what do you mean? They said, you don't understand. People come here and talk to us. They all say they're going to help us. And they don't come back. They said, people who live in Minneapolis don't come back. And the other thing they told us, if I didn't have soccer, if I didn't have football, I'd be over at the mall. And the mall is where all the recruiting is taking place. Second, there's an online cartoon called Average Muhammad. He was our conduit to this project. His name is Muhammad Ahmed. I'm very proud to say now that after hearing all the stories and looking at the emails he got from around the world when he'd go on CNN and other networks, people trying to give him money, I said, you've got to become a nonprofit. He's become a nonprofit. Justin and I serve on his board, and we're now funded by Google to support his Average Muhammad cartoons, which are vetted by the imams, and they're going out every week. Last but not least, there's a whole component of the community that are women who are not receiving any support. They're receiving support now by mostly Officer Alice White here from the Minneapolis Police Department. And I hate to tell you this, there are so many kids that have left there. The mothers have a support group, and they meet every week to talk about some of the things they're feeling and to get help. So I'm just going to close with this. As we surveyed the community, the number one thing they said in the way of help is they said, we need community engagement. We need to own this. The only way this is going to stop is if we stop it. We don't need the government to come in here and lead this effort. We have to lead this effort. Last thing I'm going to say here is for those of you who go on and do research, particularly field research, leverage your backgrounds. I had comments made to me like, I'm African. You're African American. You know what I mean when I talk about profiling. Leverage that. If you've got a skill set, Justin, my research partner, they would often say to him, you know more about Islam than I do. That was priceless. But don't try to be something that you're not. Honesty and transparency proved huge for us. There was no way in the world I was not going to tell them I used to be an FBI agent. And I hate to say this, they hated the FBI. But they were the fact that they were honest with me and said that told me an awful lot about that relationship. All the preconceived notions about why they leave and why they don't leave and what they need and don't need, I just had to put all that aside. We started with a clean slate and let them tell the story. And last but not least, community collaboration. We really did talk to them about the things that they might be able to do and what they might be able to do long term. We're going back there now. We're not funded by anybody. We're going to fly back, pay our own way, and we're going to keep that relationship going because it's important. So that's what it looks like when you come back from soccer practice in the wintertime. But I got to tell you, good people, good kids. And I wish I didn't have to tell you this is the end of the story, and I don't say it to make it sad. But 2 weeks ago, the FBI released a statement in Minneapolis and said, despite our best efforts, the flow of people from Minneapolis has not slowed down. So we have a lot of work to do. And this is just one city. So I thought today what I would talk about really was the recruitment. As we talk about lone wolves and loose networks, there's always a recruitment effort, whether it's virtual or physical, is taking place. We need to reverse engineer this and learn faster than they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erroll, for this really fascinating look at the micro level. By the way, you mentioned leveraging your background. I've made a career out of leveraging my Israeli, German, American, Persian background, so it works pretty well. Right, I got everything covered. Our last speaker is going to be Aaron Zelen from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Anybody who follows, everybody, and I'm sure that's most of the people here who follow jihadi studies, you can't avoid him because he's everywhere. One of the most prolific, insightful writers on jihadism. He's also affiliated with the ICSR at King's College London, and PhD candidate at King's College. And he's going to be talking to us today about Tunisian logistics and facilitation networks.
All right, so when I saw the title of this presentation or the panel about lone wolves and loose networks, when I thought of loose networks, it really reminded me a lot of the research that I'm doing for my dissertation about Tunisian jihadism, especially since, in the past year or two, you increasingly hear people being like, why are there so many Tunisians involved in Syria and Iraq? For those who know, they have the largest amount of individuals there that are foreign nationals. They also have the largest amount of foreign nationals fighting in Libya with either the Islamic State or Ansar al-Sharia. But I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that historically the Tunisians were more in the background of what was going on instead of being more forward-looking or as large in terms of people knowing about it. Most of the individuals that and research that people have been conducting over the years has primarily been on the leaders of organizations, on ideologues in the organizations, or even in data and information about suicide bombers and people that are foreign fighters in the past. And the thing that the Tunisians were involved in primarily, when you look back going to the networks in the 90s and early to mid-2000s, before many of them were arrested, was that they're primarily involved in facilitation, logistics, and document forgery. And therefore, they were a lot of key middlemen and cogs of many of the networks. And while many look at what's going on now through the frame of this broader AQ versus IS war between them, even though there were definitely competitive networks going on, whether it was in Europe or Algeria or more importantly, what was happening in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over, they still worked together in many ways in different areas and filled in the gaps if they needed help in many of these areas. So I would argue, even though I think that there are probably more than a few reasons why there are so many Tunisians involved in what's going on now, I would say that their involvement in these networks and being sort of the key players and really having a reach into everything that was going on really explains why they're able to get involved in the way that they have over the past couple of years. As a result, I thought I'd maybe describe a little bit of a case study or talk a little bit about the research for my dissertation. I'm not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty because I'm in it so far myself, and I sometimes get confused by it also. So I'll try and make it a little more general in some respects. But essentially, you had some entrepreneurial Tunisians that went to Afghanistan in the mid to late 1980s. They're volunteers, and then they came back to Europe after that. This is where everything pretty much started in terms of them getting involved in these types of networks. And if you look at the literature as well as many of the biographies, memoirs, and some of the primary source materials, whether it's magazines from the time, the Tunisians were always seen as the best document forgers. So they had a huge role in what was going on in Bosnia starting in 1992, 93, and 94 time period, where Peshawar, Pakistan was the hub in many ways of what was going on in relation to the Afghan jihad against the Soviets in the 80s. What we saw in the 90s was that Milan in many ways was sort of the forward operating base of these types of activities. And while the head of this operation was a man named Anwar Shaban, who is an Egyptian who had been part of Gamal Islamiyah, the key players under him were Tunisians. The most important one, I'd argue, was Sami Assid bin Khamis. And anyone who might have heard the name now knows that he eventually would become one of the leaders in Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia after 2011. So it highlights that there is these legacy networks and continuities between stuff going on all the way back to what happened in the 80s and 90s to what's been going on more recently. And bin Khamis actually was in Afghanistan in the late 80s for a bit, doing some training there. And essentially, you had them being involved in facilitating people throughout Europe and North Africa going to Bosnia. And if you look at the statistics, many of the people that went to Bosnia and fought with Katibat al-Mujahideen, which is essentially the key unit there, helping out the local Muslim community and also doing some other human rights violations, obviously. The Tunisians were highly involved in this apparatus. They were about 10 to 15% of the foreign fighters that eventually went to Bosnia over the next couple of years. And essentially the role they played was as travel agents, whether it was getting people's information and documentation correct to get over to Bosnia, or it was the forgery of documents as well. And they quickly became really important in this. And if you look at some of the key plots that would occur inside of Europe in the late 90s, as well as the bigger sort of post 9/11 type of plots, as well as attacks, there was likely a Tunisian component involved, even if they weren't necessarily the planner of the plot or the leader of the plot. They're just a crucial member of the cell or helping out with logistics and facilitation. And what this network was able to do then was leverage these skills to newer types of conflicts after that. So after Bosnia started winding down, it was sort of the height of what was happening during the Algerian Civil War. And there are key hubs with helping out the GIA, the jihadi group that was extremely takfirist in many regards. Some would argue that maybe it's a proto of what we saw with Al-Qaeda in Iraq last decade, as well as with the Islamic State now. And Tunisians were involved in helping out with these logistics of getting people into Algeria, but also with the type of operations that they're conducting inside of Europe as well. So besides the Milan hub, which I would argue has been the most important hub for the Tunisian jihadi community up until the late 2000s, though it's not really that active anymore, in part because the Italians essentially rolled up all the networks, and also because many of the people that had been arrested were then given to the Tunisians and put in Tunisian prison. And for those who knew what happened after the uprisings after 2011, many of them left these prisons in an amnesty by the government in February, March 2011. So that's part of the reason why you don't really see much in Italy going on now related to this. But anyways, besides what was happening in Milan and to a lesser extent in Bologna, there's also a network in Brussels with Tarek Maroufi. You also had two key individuals in London, Saif Allah bin Hassin, better known today as Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, as well as Kamal Maghrouk. And they're deeply involved in sort of the efforts of what Abu Qatada al-Falastini was doing. He's obviously a very important sheikh in these years. And because of this created these connections and nexus between the Algerians and Tunisians, which is very important to understand in terms of why we see so many Tunisians involved in the mid-2000s going to Iraq. Because if you look at the recruitment to Iraq last decade, those who are in North Africa would primarily be facilitated through the networks of the GSPC, which is the successor of the GIA, essentially, through Algeria, train there a little bit, and then go over to Iraq. So you have all these connections that bind them together, whether it's through the work that they're doing, but also through the communities that they're living in. Then there's another component beyond just the Algeria piece. There's everything that happened in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over in 1996. There are a bunch of different competing networks in Afghanistan, even though, as I noted, they worked together at times. You had essentially the AQ network, which was run by bin Laden, obviously. Then you had the Khaldan network, which was a training camp run by Ibn Sheikh al-Libi and Abu Zubaydah. And then you had the Zarqawi network, and I should say the AQ is primarily a host. The Khaldan network was in Jalalabad, and the Zarqawi network was in Herat. And the Tunisians, when they went there, in at least the leadership, with Saif Allah bin Hassin and Tariq Maroufi, who co-founded the Tunisian Combatant Group, they essentially set up shop in Jalalabad, so they were very much integrated into the Khaldan network, even though there was work with AQ on the hit on Ahmed Shah Massoud 2 days before 9/11. But I would argue that the Tunisians were far more integrated in what was going on in Khaldan, and because of this, also Zarqawi. And then there was another cog who wasn't based in Afghanistan, but he was based in Istanbul, this guy named Louis Saka. He was essentially the head of AQ's network in Turkey, with AQ Central, and then later with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Interestingly enough, the guy who was head of this network previously was Abu Khalid al-Suri. I'm sure the name sounds a little familiar now. He was killed by ISIS, and he was in Ahrar al-Sham. But it highlights how much all these things go back so many years, and how they're connected, and how these people pop back up again years later after you don't hear from them for a while. And while Saka was at first more with Al-Qaeda Central, he went to Afghanistan in 1999 and became more involved with the Zarqawi network in Herat. And it's important to note that when the Tunisians were facilitating people from Europe to Afghanistan, they primarily did it through Mashhad, Iran. And that was the key hub for how people went to join up with Zarqawi's network as well, since they'd go there and then go over the border to Herat. But the Tunisians would continue on to Jalalabad. So when you think about the restructuring of the Tunisian network after the fall of Tora Bora, after the U.S. invasion, the leader of the Tunisian Combatant Group, Saif Allah bin Hassin, or Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, who would go on to become the leader of Ansar al-Sharia after 2011 in Tunisia, he would be based in Istanbul before he was arrested in March 2003. But he was facilitated essentially after this fall through these networks that Louis Saka and Zarqawi were involved in through Iran and into Turkey. And the interesting thing here is that you had this shift in the center of gravity, and I think we could see this in terms of why there is this broader AQ versus IS dynamic going now, since the networks in the 80s and 90s were usually facilitated through what was going on in Afghanistan, whereas more of the things, at least in the large-scale mobilizations, are happening through the sort of, I'd argue, the Turkey-Syria-Iraq nexus with the Iraq Jihad last decade, as well as what's been going on in the last couple of years in Syria and Iraq as well. And at the time when Zarqawi was building up connections and contacts in Kurdistan, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, from December 2001 until, I guess you could say, March 2003, when the Iraq War started, he made a lot of connections with the Kurds in northern Iraq. And one of the key figures there was the founder of Ansar al-Islam, or one of the key sheikhs, Mullah Krakar. He also had citizenship in Norway, and starting in 95 through 97, he was building up a lot of recruitment networks for what his activities were in Europe as well. So one of the things that Zarqawi did was to come up with a deal with Krakar in terms of creating training camps in northern Iraq prior to the U.S. invasion, since many of them foresaw this coming. And because of this, there is an Ansar al-Islam network based in France. And actually, the first foreign fighters to go over to Iraq went to these Ansar al-Islam training camps in partnership with Zarqawi's network. And they're actually Tunisians. One of these individuals actually is a bigger name now, Boubacar al-Hakim. For those who know the name, the guy was involved in the assassination of the two leftist politicians in Tunisia, and then later was in an Islamic State video that came out of Raqqa a few months or so ago, or actually no, it was last December now. Time flies. Anyways, as you can see, all this is highly connective tissues and showing how these things were integrated. And then through the Iraq War, as I noted earlier, we saw what was going on with the Tunisians and the GSPC. When the Sahwa movement, or the tribal awakening and the surge occurred in Iraq, though, because people stopped going to Iraq as foreign fighters, though there still was a small trickle. And I'd argue that of all the nationalities, the Tunisians might have been the largest one that still went. Instead of going to Iraq, these Tunisians would then go to Algeria and train with the GSPC and then later AQIM. And they would be involved in attacks, whether it was in Algeria or even cross-border attacks in Tunisia, even though there wasn't too much coverage, or Ben Ali would cover it up and what was going on. But because of that, there were a lot of operations that the Algerian state and the Tunisian state did together to arrest a bunch of people. So then in the mid to late 2000s, you have a stew of all these jihadists that were involved with GSPC getting put in prison. You have these people that were being transferred from the prisons of Europe into Tunisian prisons as well as the returning foreign fighters that were getting arrested. And as a result, this sort of created the basis for what would become Ansar al-Sharia in many respects when all these guys were let out of prison after February, March 2011. And this pretty much explains why there are so many Tunisians involved in what's going on now, because they all came together, and I guess as some people like to call the prison in Iraq, the Buqa one, sort of the training camp or the University of Jihad for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all of his associates and what they would end up doing in Iraq. In many respects, there was a lot of planning during those years, especially after 2006, for what they would do once they got released from prison. And as a result, because of the past connections that these individuals also had with one another, as well as these other broader networks, and it's important to note, too, I didn't mention this, I forgot to say it, is that after Louay Saka, the Syrian Kurdish guy who was mentioning, who is the head of the AQ network in Turkey, after he was arrested in 2005 for being involved in the 2003 Istanbul bombings, as well as plotting another attack that he was caught for. The person that came after him was actually a Tunisian named Malak Sheheli, and so a Tunisian was head of the AQ network in Turkey there, highlighting the connectivity between sort of the AQI, or I guess at that point you could say Islamic State of Iraq networks. And as a result, though he would eventually get arrested also in 2007, but it shows how connected they are to what was going on in this scene related to everything in Iraq. So once these people essentially were let out of prison, and as we saw, this happened in Libya, in Egypt, there were prison breaks in Yemen, the Syrian regime let people out of prison. All these guys knew each other from the past, and therefore they're just restarting the game once again. So in many ways, I would argue this is the primary factor. And I'd say after doing this research for my district, this is just part of a chapter of the dissertation. I would say that one of the things we could learn as, researchers and academics is that while it's important to look at the, leadership and the group level, in many ways, what are we missing by not looking at these sort of informal networks related to these facilitation and logistics and what's going on? I think that it's really a fruitful area, and I'd argue that a lot could potentially be done, especially in the sphere of these individuals in Turkey and Syria, since there really hasn't been a lot written about them, at least prior to 2011 timeframe. So I'll just leave it at there, since I'm sure you probably want your break now. So, hearing us drone on for a while, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for coming, even though you suffered through food poisoning. So you held up quite well, I have to say. And actually, your last comment, Aaron's last comment about, what are we missing by looking through the lens of organizations was really kind of the question I wanted to ask. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a 10-minute break so you can grab some coffee. But just before you go, I'm going to just pose this question to the entire panel so you can think. You'll have 10 minutes to think about it, come back and answer. And then we'll open it to questions from the audience. We'll have about an hour. But when we're looking at the future evolving threat of terrorism, are we using the right frame of reference right now? I mean, what is going to be the main threat of terrorism looking forward? Is it going to be based mostly on these informal actors, on the networks, or lone wolves? Or do you believe that the actual threat, the most important threat, are terrorist organizations like the old time, the classic formal terrorist organization? Or is that even the right way to look at it? Right? Is there even a difference between the two? Because some might argue, which certainly that these organizations themselves exist of networks, right? So this is just something I'm going to throw out there. You'll have 10 minutes to think about it, and we'll see you back very soon.
Really enjoyed it definitely has a thematic feel to it.
Thank you. In Georgetown, Chris I went to this NA in 2011. I've been so many places. They can give you a card. We were needing things in Georgia. Of course, you know Robbie well, so that's who I came over with. Okay. Thank you, sir. Enjoy.
Why was it fascinating?
Information from the outside. Some letter about his lawyer actually
It's always interesting because also there's things going on in this jailhouse kind of situations. Sure. Like I was offered this year where
there's stuff that you don't know. We're doing well, that's why that's why I also mentioned that while so many people are looking at everything now, I think we should rise lens a lot more involved and complicated with it, even if there were these competitive networks. But I think that I honestly think that that's clouding a lot of research that people are doing when they're looking at past stuff.
I can't say that.
Where I can find a study,
What I
you know what you should do? Go to
look at ways to better understand.
No, that's definitely true too.
yes, and you're
to work with others to try and help me understand.
You'll see all my stuff here. Or fire study. And you can't. If you don't find email,
What's up?
No, it was caffeine to my son because he was supposed to.
I want to talk to you. Want to try that.
Let me answer this quick for one. The quick version is
No. Our understanding human nature through and I don't think there's any other explanation for terrorism and the things that happen with terrorism, or for lone wolves or anything else. Within, not just terrorism, it explains everything. I just wanted to tell you how thrilled and joyful I was to someone bring into an academic atmosphere when it's rejected. And it's so sad.
It provides. Well, thank you. I appreciate your comments. I need to get some sleep.
It's probably not the favorite question.
What if it's not?
Are there any policy, from your study, dispelled a lot of these, there were a lot of things that I thought true. The mosque, the social media, because the government we've done something with it, decided
That's
very
man, human God connection that us, because it's severed. That's what causes us, is my limited ability to articulate it, causes us to have this fear of our own, that lack of connection, the terror associated with our own death, and that if there isn't a God, if there isn't God, then we have no soul, and this is it. And why am I here? And at some level, we are all confronted with those questions at various points in our lives about why are we here? What am I doing? And so this perspective of acknowledgement of heroism,
if you're the only target, you're going to target us.
is the prime assessment of why people.
That's very valid point. So as a policy, I even said to Senator Councilman McCall, we feel that bill to have Officer CDS because if this is wrong, we're going to you're going to lose it. Don't do this.
It's a Jewish
you
thing.
don't need assistance of CDE. If you're going to do it, make it an announcement that we're going to
The nations were scattered,
we can think of.
and I will bring you back to
If you don't,
this is
it's not going to work.
Do you think that the Boston program and the other cities, that it's destroying the relationship between state troops, the police, and these communities?
I'm going to speak secondhand about Boston and LA. I do know that Boston, LA, Minneapolis is pretty united on the fact that it's not Victorian CB is alienating me. I will say this though, the United States attorneys in those three cities and some of law enforcement seem to have a pretty good relationship with those communities. However, a larger community is saying, we don't trust them. So there are some bridges being built.
We need a flesh.
Yeah, but that, how should I say that? That perception of what CBD is, and pushing people to fuel
I will do it. There's no religion there.
that perception.
I will cleanse you.
That's a really great presentation.
I will take
I'm not doing a little work on
no religion.
non-Western foreign fighters, and
No religion.
we talk a lot about Western foreign fighters,
That's why the just
especially in the media right now.
no religion. But I'm thrilled to speak about to read from John. Just Leslie Richard.
Let's check for a minute or two before you go. That was phenomenal.
Okay, yeah, of course.
My Lord.
I'm his biggest fan.
And so I'm sure
I was just
wherever
saying
you
that
are
it's
in the
interesting to
journey
hear
that
other perspective about Western foreign fighters. I think that we focus a lot on Western foreign fighters. We have reasons to maybe have reintegration programs or
and I was like, you're
for
right? Well,
I just did.
I went to Duke.
Well, good.
I headed out early.
It's nice to meet you.